Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. I'm your host, Ajay Shamdasani. We'll kick off today's episode with a spotlight discussion with Dr. Amber Phillips, a senior lecturer in criminology in the UK, on the importance of accredited financial investigators in ferreting out fraud. Following that, we'll be chatting with author Sangeet Choudary about his new book, Reshuffle: Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. He reframes the artificial intelligence debate by making the case that AI should not be seen as a smarter brain necessarily, but rather as a better glue, bringing people together and building on synergies that emerge from their efforts merged together. But first, on a recent episode of the Tax Justice Network's podcast, Dr. Amber Phillips noted the importance of accredited financial investigators and how they're often the unsung heroes when it comes to cracking case. A little bit about Dr. Phillips. She's a senior lecturer in criminology at UWE Bristol. Her journey as a criminologist began in 2012 while living and working in Calabria, Italy. Her primary research interests are organized crime and economic crime, both of which draw on her continuing interest in mafia-type groups. She has developed collaborative partnerships with law enforcement practitioners and fellow academics in the UK and abroad, and is a member of the ECPR Standing Group on Organized Crime, as well as the Royal Uniform Services Institute Strategic Hub for Organized Crime, better known as by its acronym RUSI. Amber's work has been published in international journals, including Trends in Organized Crime, and she is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Economic Criminology. Her most recent work has focused on the social reuse of confiscated mafia assets in Italy and the challenges faced by police officers investigating financial crime. She's currently researching asset recovery in England and Wales, supported by a VC Early Career Researcher Award. She's also an expert reviewer for funding bodies such as the European Commission and the Independent Social Research Foundation. She has a rather illustrious CV. You can read her bio on our website. Now I will turn to her. Amber, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So there are a couple of reasons which will become clear why I'm asking this question, but why are accredited financial investigators, and I'll include with them asset recovery experts, because they're affiliated fields, and oftentimes financial investigations necessarily also entail an asset recovery component to them from talking to folks of the Big Four. So why are they so important?
Why are they so important? Well, the role that they perform is very specific and very important. So I'm not sure how much your listeners will be aware of the AFI role in the UK. So just to sum it up in a nutshell, all accredited financial investigators are accredited by the National Crime Agency, and they are working to enforce powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act. And there are a lot of different bodies that have Proceeds of Crime Act powers. So we might obviously think of police forces, the National Crime Agency, regional organised crime units, but also bodies like local councils in England and Wales can have their own financial investigators. So the range of investigations that AFIs are working on are really quite broad. And the ambition, the scope of the powers that they can apply under the Proceeds of Crime Act is quite impressive. And the results that they can achieve are also quite impressive if they're given the support that they need to work effectively.
The thing of it is, though, very often people in law enforcement don't possess financial backgrounds. I remember when I was deputy editor of A+, the magazine, the Hong Kong Institute of CPAs, we had a case of a guy who was an accountant who became a cop, and obviously that he did a great public service for Hong Kong by doing that, because they needed people like him in the Commercial Crimes Bureau and the Financial Crimes Team. But that's not the norm. If you look to popular culture, the perception from TV and movies is, very often they don't crack cases doing real police work, and that's more akin to what a financial investigator would would do. So I do feel people don't appreciate that, but in an age when increasingly people are saying substantive knowledge of money laundering, financial crime, investigation, that doesn't matter as much, because increasingly what you're going to see is your financial crime compliance teams are going to be led by data scientists, and it's all going to be AI, and it's going to be about trawling through vast amounts of data and discerning themes and patterns and trends. Uh, what are your thoughts that it, in a world of data scientists and AI playing an increasing role in financial crime investigations, what is what is the role of a financial investigator in a new century like that? Or do they still have a role, or will they essentially have to be
Definitely.
techies? Will they have to burn up on their skills? So
Well,
many
they're
things
not
come to
mutually
mind.
exclusive. I mean, yeah, I would say they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, I think there's been a push for a number of years now to further integrate financial investigation. If we're talking specifically about law enforcement, there has been a tendency in the past, I think I can safely say this, to kind of silo financial investigation. Some of the participants I spoke to as part of my research said that they'd been known in the past as the dark arts of financial investigation, or they were known as the Monopoly Squad within their police force. So there wasn't that integration. It was very much something that was siloed
Well,
and kind of.
actually, and quite understandably, because a lot of the time it was people with law enforcement or military or intelligence backgrounds that went into the private sector to do such work.
Well, I mean, if I'm speaking specifically within police forces, if they had a financial investigation unit or a financial intelligence unit, it was something that was sort of separate and seen as not part of everyday policing, if that makes sense. But I would say it very much is. I mean, if we're taking out the
Yeah,
financial crimes angle, even
something
things like,
akin then to special, something akin to intelligence or special.
yeah, or just using the tools of financial investigation for what we might call everyday policing. So, locating high risk missing people, for example, financial investigation's got a key role to play there. So, it has a wider scope of application than quote unquote just financial crimes. But yeah, I mean, I don't think technology and financial investigation are mutually exclusive. I think the skills that financial investigators are bringing to investigations of all kinds will continue to be relevant even as the scope of technology moves forward. I mean, we've seen these new crypto powers introduced under the Proceeds of Crime Act, and it's financial investigators that are using those powers. So again, there's no sense of exclusivity there, I would say.
I guess then we come to the issue of accreditation, and I don't think Charles Entriago, the founder of ACAMS, knew the can of worms, the Pandora's box he was opening, when in early 2001 he started ACAMS. 9/11 happened, and it was a matter of timing. He became a very wealthy man because then the Patriot Act came out. The emphasis on, the focus on terrorist financing and money laundering, and everyone wanted to get accredited. Compliance became a big thing. And since then, you've had groups like ICA, ACFS. I guess, credentials are useful. They're no substitute for experience. Yet, in a marketplace that keeps demanding experience, and the joke is everyone wants a 30-year-old with 20 years of experience,
And
that increasingly these credentials, and you have a lot of people in this space in compliance and AML writ large that have a lot of letters after their names. They've gone to the trouble and the expense of gaining these credentials. These credentials are being seen as a proxy for experience. And yes, they've clearly learned a lot uh, about anti-money laundering and financial crime and CTF and KYC and sanctions from gaining these credentials. But is Bill Miker, one of our earliest guests, who was an undercover operative and actually got his hands dirty and engaged in money laundering while he was living
mm,
his dual life, said to me, one should not assume. There are a lot of AML experts. There are not that many money laundering experts. Therefore, these credentials
mm,
should not be seen as a substitute for experience, but increasingly because of the market, because of the way recruiters think and act, they are being used as a proxy for experience. What are your thoughts?
I wouldn't know that I'm terribly qualified to comment on that score. I mean, my research specifically focuses more on the public sector. So the accredited financial investigator title is given by the National Crime Agency. I mean, the problem that we have in the public sector is that a lot of very well qualified and experienced AFIs are being tempted away by the private sector because the public sector can't keep up in terms of pay offering. So in terms
Correct.
of the loss of talent in the public sector, that's definitely a huge concern, and retention of AFIs is a bit of an issue that we have, certainly in the UK. So that would be my concern from that angle,
And
I
I
think.
and I've seen the salaries they're offering in London, and despite the hard times, that there's no short. You can do very well for yourself in this space.
But I suppose so one of the elements of my research was around motivation. So what motivates financial investigators? What keeps them in the job? Because the people that I spoke to were obviously all still working within the public sector. And I mean, if you'll allow me to derail the discussion slightly,
Please,
um,
yes,
the UK government's Asset Recovery Action Plan has 4 objectives for asset recovery. So the 4 Ds: disrupt, deprive, discredit, and deter. But one of the things that came out from my interviews with financial investigators was that these 4 Ds don't really cover the main motivation for what's keeping people in the role. And that final D, the fifth D, in my opinion, should be destination, where this money is going. Because people that are staying in the public sector and, aren't getting those big salaries, they're staying in the job because they want to see that money going back either to victims in the cases of fraud or more broadly to society. So bringing that money back into the public's purse and doing something positive with it, that is a big motivator that's keeping a lot of AFIs in the job, and it doesn't necessarily get the focus that it needs.
from the financial crime people or former law enforcement that I've seen who've gone to work at banks in this region, Hong Kong and Singapore, a lot of them complain about burnout. A lot of them complain about not being allowed to really do their jobs properly, about
Yeah.
siloed structures, about turf wars and fiefdoms within financial institutions, people not sharing information. And the attitude is, I'd rather walk away if I can't do
Mm.
my job right. So, those are some of the stories I've heard from them once they've gone to the private sector, that compliance is seen as a perfunctory function, but don't you dare take it too seriously to the point where it's going to impinge on the bottom line. So that's and if that's the
Interesting.
message you get, and you're serious about you know your profession and your commitment to the truth, then yeah, I can see why people walk away. But something you pointed out recently was that stripping criminals of their assets would be more effective than short custodial sentences. Could you elaborate on that?
So do you mean more effective than custodial sentences?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I suppose that's the entire philosophy behind asset recovery legislation, is the idea that it's more of a more effective deterrent to remove assets than it is to apply custodial sentences. I mean, the extent to which that's true remains unclear. I mean, watch this space, but I'm about to begin a research project that looks into the deterrent impact of asset recovery. So that's coming hopefully in the new year. The indications we have are that it is a good deterrent, but there's not enough data empirically to confirm it either way. Certainly, the professionals that I spoke to were of the opinion that it was a good functional deterrent. And more than the deterrent side, also disruption. So the idea of so a lot of the criticism that's come at asset recovery in general as a concept has been based on the idea that it's not applied effectively, and that it ends up disproportionately affecting what's called the lower hanging fruit. So, your smaller fry of criminals who don't have the resources necessarily to invest in professionals who can help them squirrel away their assets. But there's an argument to be made, I think, that disrupting somebody earlier on in their criminal career and maybe taking away a smaller amount of money, because that's all that criminal has available, has the possibility to disrupt them at a key point in their criminal career and prevent them from going forward and going on to further things. But when it comes to measuring success in asset recovery, obviously we can't measure prevention or what doesn't happen, if that makes sense. So it's a sticky area. Measuring success in asset recovery is sticky and complicated. But there's a lot of things to consider beyond the actual number, that the bottom line that's coming back in.
No, I hear what you're saying. All too often people focus on the pecuniary, and in fact, that was going to be my segue into the next question, which is the research project that you're wrapping up about measuring success in financial recovery. I believe it's called Beyond the Figures, moving beyond quantitative measures, because numbers aren't always a good measure of the impact and success in asset recovery. Um, and yeah, you will see the headlines. We recovered X amount, and that you know that may or may not make people whole. But something that you said during your recent interview with uh, I think Natalie Fowler at Tax Justice Network was that when investigators tell you that what's meaningful to them is turning bad money into good. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it comes back to that destination idea, the idea that even if the investigators don't know exactly where the money is going, the sort of the moral, ethical aspect of taking money away from somebody who's obtained it by illicit means and turning it back to the communities that have been affected by crime, or giving it back to the public purse in some way, they see as a vital part of their role, and it's a big source of satisfaction for the people that are doing that job. And it's part of a narrative. I think the new FATF guidance that's recently come out about asset recovery views the whole process much more holistically than we tend to. This focus on the end result doesn't see the whole strand of the narrative, if that makes sense. So the most satisfied investigators that I spoke to were people that saw the entire asset recovery story from the beginning to the very end, where the money was returned either back to the public purse or to a victim or to a specific social reuse project. And this is why figures are never enough, because they don't tell a story. Narratives are intuitively a much more effective way of communicating the impact of any policy than just giving somebody a number on a balance sheet. So I think telling the story from beginning to end of the origin of money and where it ultimately returns is quite powerful and much more effective than, as I say, just giving that number on the bottom of a balance sheet.
I agree. I mean, there is a human side to this, though. Large figures do make for good headlines from a search engine optimization standpoint, and I think that is all too often what they're aiming for. Again, the fixation is on the pecuniary, on the financial, and all too often
Yeah,
that overshadows that eclipses the fundamental human story. As I said, sometimes even getting your money back doesn't necessarily make people whole,
yeah,
because other
yeah.
things have happened along the way.
Plus, I think I might push back and say who's reading the headline, because certainly, and again, it depends on the scale of the criminality that we're looking at, because this isn't a one size fits all situation, and different criminals are going to require different kinds of intervention. But in the communities that are being affected, say we're looking at drug dealing, for example, if you're looking at communities that are being ravaged by that kind of crime, people in those communities aren't reading headlines about financial confiscation. They just don't care. But if you are bringing resources back into that community, if you're providing, for example, rehabilitation support or community centres or playgrounds, resources that people in that community can tangibly use and see, that has a significant impact. And we have to, I think, again, maybe even consider looking at asset recovery as a much longer term investment in prevention and in society more broadly, which again is not so satisfying. It's not so easy to quantify, but it is a significant part of the story, I think.
Well, certainly asset recovery can provide the means to do good, but I don't. Again, aiding the victims and giving them some semblance of social justice perhaps requires more involvement. It requires more of a personal investment by society, and that often gets overlooked. Um, in the, I mean, I don't have further questions, but in the time we've got left, do you have any? Is there anything you'd like to say to our audience, or anything you feel we didn't touch upon?
Really, I suppose I'd always encourage people to consider asset recovery as a full story, and just zooming in on small parts of that story can only give you part of the picture. That's such a truism, but there we go.
Well, Amber Phillips, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. And we're back. We're chatting with author Sangeet Paul Choudary about his new book entitled Reshuffle: Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. In it, he reframes the artificial intelligence debate, which is one of the most hyped about technology of our time, as not necessarily being about a smarter brain, but a better glue. From the overlooked brilliance of the shipping container to the F1 pits that dethroned Schumacher's dominance, he unearths a powerful pattern. The most transformative technologies do not merely automate, they transform entire economic systems. With vivid storytelling and razor-sharp analysis, Reshuffle connects the dots between technology, behavior, and economic architecture. It delivers a bold and incisive exploration of how AI's impact goes far beyond changing how we work to reorient the foundations of power and control in our economic systems. Blending compelling examples, historical parallels, and bold insights, Reshuffle equips readers to navigate the many opportunities and challenges that AI introduces while reshaping the knowledge economy. This, frankly, is a book that's your guide to understanding who wins and who gets left behind when AI restacks the deck, which it invariably will. And it begs a fundamental question. What if we've misunderstood the real power of AI? Not as a tool for doing tasks faster, but as the missing mechanism for making complex systems finally work together. As for Sangeet himself, he's the co-author of another book called The Platform Revolution. And as for his latest work, Reshuffle, it's the subject of today's discussion and was recently awarded with the 2025 Thinkers 50 Strategy Award at Guildhall in London for the most impactful idea in the field of strategy. Thinkers 50 is often described by the Financial Times as the quote-unquote Oscars of management thinking. It is the premier global recognition for leading management thinkers. Other shortlisted nominees this year included Karim Lakhani, Harvard Business School, Vijay Govindarajan of Dartmouth, Richard Rumelt of UCLA, and Seth Godin. Sangeet has advised CEOs across more than 40 Fortune 500 companies, as well as leading pre-IPO technology firms. He is currently a senior fellow at the University of California's Berkeley campus, and he's spoken at premier global forums, including the G20 Summit, the World 50 Summit, and the World Economic Forum. Sangeet's book offers a radical rethink of AI and a practical contribution to industry incumbents grappling with the onset of Gen AI. We've all heard the common refrain from the likes of Peter Zeihan and other futurists that, quote, AI won't take your job, but someone else using AI will. At this point, it's a hackneyed phrase, but Sangeet's message is to the heads and executives of legacy banking and financial institutions and corporates across multiple sectors. For veterans of the financial services world, particularly, that industry is still dealing with COBOL-based mainframes and siloed databases. Reshuffle provides an excellent guide to thinking about how artificial intelligence will disrupt financial services and how AI can actually be harnessed in that field. So, with that, I turn over to the man himself. Sangeet, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ajay. Real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I've said enough about your book, but tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What's your background?
Well, I grew up in a small town in India, and most people in the town I came from, a town called Bokaro, um, you know, worked on very traditional paths of going ahead and getting an engineering degree, and then going ahead and getting a management degree, and I think that was sort of a common career path that my generation pursued. But once I got into the workforce, that was when the digital revolution was just kicking off in the mid 2000s, and I started seeing things that started fascinating me. That the real impact of digital technologies, even though it was often simplistically explained as things like we're moving from offline to online, or we're moving from non-tech to tech, I believe that there was something much deeper that was happening. And so the last 15 years I've dedicated my work towards understanding what really happens when digital technologies come in and transform an industry, or more broadly an economic and a social system. And inevitably it leads to a shift in how companies compete. It leads to a shift in how the winners win, and it essentially reshuffles the deck, to use the words of my new book. So my previous book looked at um, the shift towards platforms as one of the ways to understand how digital technologies restack or reshuffle an economic system, and now I look at it from the lens of what's happening with AI. So this whole idea of how technology changes winners and losers in any economic system has been the underpinning question that's driven my work over the past 15 years.
You were there at a critical time in your career. What was it that drew you to AI, and why the compelling need to write this book now? That, I mean, given that it seems like the marketplace seems flooded with literature on this topic. What's unique or novel or first impression about your book in your view?
Yeah, no, you're right that there's a flood of books on this topic, and what really prompted me to write this book was essentially the many conversations I was having on one end with C-level executives, because a large part of my work for the past 15 years has been helping executives think about these shifts and what that means for strategy. So at the one end, it was that, and at the other end, it was everybody out there at dinner parties, on LinkedIn, thinking about what AI does to their job. And I felt that there were fallacies at both ends in terms of how we think about both how companies should be thinking about AI, but also how we as individuals navigating our career should be thinking about AI. And that's what I try to do in the book. I try to reconcile these two framings together and say that fundamentally it's about understanding how AI changes the rules of the game, how AI changes how we compete, whether as companies in an industrial system or whether as individuals navigating our careers. And there are three key framings I use in the book, which uh, I believe is not used in any other book, and which essentially runs counter to the dominant narrative that is being pushed by most books today. So the first framing I use is that we overemphasize the intelligence aspect of AI, and we underemphasize the system into which AI is deployed, and we underemphasize the larger economic system and how that changes around any new technology. So my key point over there is that um, we think about AI largely in terms of intelligence metaphors. So metaphors like do you have a fifth grader or a PhD in your pocket with every new model that's coming out? So we're very fixated on the idea of intelligence. But my key argument there is that even if we don't get to certain benchmarks of intelligence, even if we look at AI as it stands today, and the many criticisms that people have about the fact that it may or may not be intelligent, even its current performance levels, we have not reorganized economic activity around it. We have not reoriented our workflows to absorb those capabilities. We have not redesigned our products to compete on the basis of these new capabilities. So we've not really absorbed it into our businesses, even at its current levels. And what we should really be focusing on is less about thinking about whether the technology is intelligent enough or not, and less about comparing it with human intelligence, which I believe is a big distraction, and more about thinking about how can we maximize the impact of this technology by appropriately absorbing it into our workflows, our organizations, and our systems. So that's the first point that I talk about. The second point that I raise over here is that very often we think of AI as a way to do something faster, better, cheaper. And this is not unique to AI. That's our view of technology in general. But the history of technological shifts shows us that the real power of a technology really plays out not by helping us do things faster, better, and cheaper in today's frame, but essentially re-architecting and reorienting economic activity around a new set of assumptions. So to clarify that, let me explain a simple assumption that goes away with AI today. So the traditional assumption of the knowledge industry has been that knowledge work is scarce. So you need to train people, you need to hire people who have been to college. Even after you hire them, you need to constantly train them before they can perform certain forms of knowledge work at certain levels of output. And so accessing knowledge work has historically been expensive. And my point is that with ever improving AI, certain forms of knowledge work are becoming remarkably cheap to access. A very simple example of this is translation of documents, which required a fair degree of training in the past. Even till 4 to 5 years back, it was very expensive because you needed highly trained translators. And today, a lot of that can happen with a prompt. And so there's certain forms of knowledge work. This is not a blanket statement. There's certain forms of knowledge work that are becoming much cheaper to access. And so when that assumption changes, that knowledge work was expensive to access, when that assumption changes, then entire economic structures that have been built around that assumption, the whole idea of a professional services firm is built around that assumption. All of those things are now up for re-architecture because the underlying assumption has changed. So that's my second point, that it's not really about making things better, faster, cheaper, the way they work today, but reimagining what should be done based on the new assumption. And the third key point that I make then is that we often focus on the impact of AI at the level of an individual task. So we look at, can it do something better than humans, or can it help humans? So is it automation or augmentation? But really, the impact of AI on our jobs and our companies plays out not just at the level of these individual tasks, but it plays out at every level. AI changes how tasks are performed. It changes which kinds of workflows should be performed and which ones should not be, and how those workflows should be structured. It will eventually change how companies compete. And when the logic of competition changes, which capabilities companies will value internally will change as well. And when that happens, jobs get impacted not because AI was good at doing certain tasks, but because it changed the logic of competition, and hence fundamentally new capabilities were valued in the new logic of competition. So whoever had those capabilities or gets access to those capabilities or builds those capabilities, they are poised to win in the future economy. So these are the reframings that I believe are sorely missing from the current narrative, and that's really the positioning of the message of this book. It runs counter to a lot of traditional ideas that we have around AI as automation and AI as improving the task.
Oh, it certainly does. I mean, you pull no punches. I mean, Hong Kong and Singapore being financial hubs. I mean, many of the readers here will be keen to hear what you have to say to those in that part of the economy. But for leaders in financial services, I mean, your framework is pretty. I mean, it offers practical, actionable guidance, but also it's also pretty sobering and stark that there is going to be a penalty for those that fall behind. But I mean, the four key points that leapt out at me. One, AI is not an upgrade, but a governance shift. It changes how control is exercised from top-down compliance to bottom-up feedback. Governance emerges not through rules, but through continuous observation. Second, legacy integration is a coordination challenge, not a software one. AI exposes the limits of point solutions by making evident the frictions between them. Third, the new competition operates above the algorithm. Those who own the models may not capture the most value. Those who orchestrate decisions and distribution around them will. And fourth, traditional productivity metrics are misleading. Efficiency inside a department can destroy coherence across the enterprise. The metric to optimize coordination is quality. I mean, this goes so far beyond just the whole, efficiency that comes from automation and all of that I mean, in this context, financial institutions clearly face a choice, right? That either hang on to the rigid, antiquated structures of yesteryear, or be active in developing dynamic new ecosystems. And I guess the former optimizes for compliance, the latter is more about competing for relevance in the current marketplace. So you're very forward thinking, but you're also very pointed and very punchy in your points. You don't pull any, you don't sugarcoat any of this. You don't you don't put on the kid gloves, I've noticed.
No, you're right. I think, a lot of these things are going to play out over not months, but probably quarters and years. But the speed at which these shifts will happen will be dramatically faster than some of the previous technological revolutions. And I'll explain why I believe that. So AI is coming in today as a continuation of at least two previous shifts in technology that have already impacted financial services. So I would argue that the first shift in technology that impacted all industries was a consumer side shift, where we gained the ability to personalize and serve customer journeys much better. And that's what happened with the rise of the social web, with the rise of the smartphone, and the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s was the revolution on the consumer side of the financial services value chain, as also for many other industries. But then the mid 2010s onwards, we've seen a revolution, or a re-architecture on the supply side, through more of openness and modularity of the value chain. And that's true for financial services as well, primarily because of open banking and PSD2 and the other similar regulations kicking in. So what happens then is that AI now comes in and layers on top of these shifts, these two shifts that have already happened. So the first, if you want to be a consumer-centric financial service provider, so far it meant understanding consumer data and really personalizing the consumer experience, serving a larger range of use cases because of better credit scoring, better KYC because of using non-traditional forms of data, and so on. But now with AI, you can do many other additional shifts on the consumer experience. The first thing is that traditionally, help was either hard coded. So any form of customer support was either hard coded in the form of help documents and static workflows, or it was episodic in the sense that somebody had to call a call center. But what AI helps us do is it helps us embed intelligence into customer journeys and into products. So customer support doesn't have to be reactive and episodic. It can be continuous with an AI assistant working alongside you. So the nature of the customer relationship, or the right to serve the customer, shifts based on who is best able to guide the customer in the customer journey. And this is a key argument that I place in the book, that over the last 15 years, we've seen repeated layers of disintermediation happening across industries, and financial services is no stranger to that, where better ability to support customers in their customer journey gives somebody else the right to disintermediate a service provider and gain the right to serve the customer. So we'll see a new range of players emerge who will be intelligence first, who will eliminate the need for support, which was, going back to my point, if you only thought of AI as make things better, faster, cheaper, you would speed up the call center. But if you thought of AI as reimagine the system, you would eliminate the logic of a call center, because the intelligence should be embedded into the customer journey and the product. So that's one example, right? And let's move away from the customer interface and go back to the modular value chain. So over the past 10 years, we've seen banks repeatedly open up their APIs. They call it an API marketplace. It goes by many different names. And, I've been on the advisory boards of multiple banks, ING, Standard Bank. I was on the board of directors of the Apex Exchange by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And in all of these, in all of these vantage points, I've seen banks repeatedly open up their APIs, call it a marketplace. But very often you end up simply commoditizing your capability. You don't end up really capturing value back from that capability. And even if you look at what happened on the fintech side, and I have the central framework in the book of unbundling and rebundling of a value chain. Most fintechs unbundled the bank, but if they simply stopped at unbundling, they did not continue to gain power. The ones that gained power were the ones who rebundled financial services around a new layer, whether it was around the customer, a company like Square, or it was around the transaction, a company like Stripe. They had to rebundle. And so the second point that I want to make is AI creates a new mechanism for rebundling, because traditional rebundling required standardized interfaces like APIs and standardized instructions in terms of how they should be connected into structured workflows. Today, if you look at a lot of agentic execution, it does not rely on standardized interfaces. It can work with any human readable web interface. It doesn't require structured data. It can work with unstructured data and make sense of it. You have innovation in interfaces and how activity and assets can be accessed across interfaces. Traditionally, that was done largely through APIs or through structured feeds. And today you have model context protocols and other forms of new interface technologies that are coming in. So my point is the mechanisms of rebundling and creating larger business models around these building blocks across the value chain that have already been created. We'll see a lot of innovation in that. We'll see intelligence embedded at every level, not just into the customer journey, but every single capability can be restructured, rebundled, recombined across the value chain using intelligence. And that will be how we start competing around the openness that has already been infused across the financial services value chain. So these are just two examples of how you layer on AI onto the existing landscape, and you realize that the value of AI is not in making things better, faster, cheaper within our current workflows, but in re-architecting and rethinking how competition works.
It's a brave new world of AI, and clearly the old corporate playbook for digital transformation no longer works. But I mean, I guess there is a silver lining too, in that there's no reason why financial institutions and banks writ large can't leverage AI to remain leaders in their field, or even be the ones that set the rules for this new emerging Web3 financial architecture that's emerging, and of which AI is going to be a key part. Uh, but I mean, clearly, AI, the tone of the tenor of your book suggests that AI requires an even more radical approach than digitalization. And in that regard, I'm not saying this to be hyperbolic or rhapsodic or solicitous, but your book is a damn good primer. I can't recommend it enough. I couldn't put it down. I mean, when you think about much of what we've heard about AI in the past few years, particularly since the emergence of large language models and generative AI, a lot of it is quite misleading. And when I think of your book, it's not so much a book for techies; it's more of a business book. It's not leisure reading, but it's engaging and engrossing. And again, a lot of AI books put me to sleep, but yours really got to me. It really engrossed me, and I'm not a techie, because it offers a lucid, practical take on how AI will impact organizations, industries, and individuals. I mean, for example, the discussion around AI is usually around automation, as we've discussed, but that's also where the quandary, the disaster lies, because the real issue, as you point out, is not how smart the machine is, it's what does the system look like once it adopts the new logic of this machine. And again, as you further articulate, the distinction is key, because banking and financial institutions have long used technology for efficiency to automate compliance or do batch processing or reconciliation. Yet the real power of AI is in the ability to coordinate fragmented systems and align decisions and workflows and relationships in a way that was previously impossible and perhaps even unthinkable.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for the kind words about the book, and that was really my intent with this, with writing this book. That I wanted to shift the the narrative away from talking about the technology or about automation, because those are the two primary narratives today. Where the hype that we have today from the AI vendors focuses on the intelligence and technology, and the adoption hype that goes into the customers focuses on the workflows and automation. And so um, both of these fundamentally miss the point of what's possible here. And I the other thing you'll note in what I did with the book is I don't uh, talk very specifically about large language models alone. I think large language models have been great in terms of waking up the entire world to the possibilities. They've been great in terms of uh, starting and creating demand on the consumer side before trying to find enterprise adoption. And we've seen several previous shifts, whether it was smartphone mobility or the social web and social technologies, where the consumer adoption predated enterprise adoption and created unique entry points into the enterprise that the incumbents could not compete with. So I feel very positive about those two aspects. I don't necessarily feel entirely positive about overextending what can be done with LLMs. And I somehow, increasingly see evidence that we're at the end of what can be extracted from LLMs, and we're going to see other ways in which AI will evolve more broadly. And so I think the good thing is that the fact that we started with the consumerization of technology, as opposed to everything that we've called AI before this, which were largely predictive machine learning models, etc., which had, on the consumer side, they were largely absorbed within recommendation systems, but most of them were enterprise focused otherwise. So the the good thing is that there's a big focus and a significant uh, narrative that has been created around funneling attention towards this topic of what AI can do for businesses. The problem as it stands today is that because the hype far exceeds um, the business results, and the hype far exceeds the business results, not because AI isn't good enough. If you talk to most people in enterprises, they'll say that the bottleneck is not the capabilities of AI, but the ability to allocate it to the right use cases internally to see that value. So that is still missing internally. There are no clearly defined metrics of whether a certain workflow has delivered the right outcomes. And the other thing that's sort of holding the right adoption of AI back is um, this overt emphasis on thinking of AI as a coworker or a teammate, which is good when you think about it at the level of a job. But when you're thinking about it at the level of a company, you have to think about it as a build versus buy decision about new capabilities. So in order to make that decision, you need to have clear um, metrics and clear benchmarks to see whether the impact on the enterprise productivity has actually showed up. So even if we take away the long term view, even in the short term, the level of ambiguity that surrounds AI adoption kind of holds us back from seeing many of these aspects. So I believe that we'll see this shift happen at three different levels. First of all, we'll need to see some kind of a very short term um, clarity that goes beyond just the narrative hype to say, here's how we measure what's really happening. Here are ways in which we can see the impact showing through, and on the basis of that we can make choices about which capabilities are worth investing in. Should we build them? Should we buy them? I mean, that's how you build out your capability stack over time. So first of all, that discussion has to find clear base. Secondly, we need to once we figure out how to value these capabilities better, we need to start thinking about which of these are strategic, and given that, how can we innovate in fundamentally new ways. So going back to my point, with banks opening up APIs, they've put out a lot of their traditional capabilities, modularized it, and put it out for um, easy access. But the ability to really capture significant value will come through when they do recombinant innovation with those capabilities. And AI, again, acts as a really important ingredient over there. So once we've valued AI as a capability, we need to start thinking about recombinant innovation with AI. And then we need to start thinking about business model innovation. What does this mean in terms of what we could do? One of the key points that I make in the book is that we're bound to see value migration happening. And a very simple way to think about value migration is, if traditionally value was tied to expensive expertise, which is what the professional services firms provided, and some of that expertise is now cheaply available, that value has to move somewhere else. But you can apply that logic to almost any industry. You think of the material science industry, or the synthetic biology industry. I mean, these are all inputs into multiple value chains. For example, any industry, any downstream industry, whether it's automotive or pharmaceutical, any of these downstream industries that use material science or synthetic biology, the cost of experimentation and the cost of innovation has dramatically dropped because of AI. And so when that cost of innovation and experimentation drops, the value no longer sits with the labs, the value moves somewhere else. The value moves less with generating new compounds and more with validating those compounds. And so the companies that will understand, where value is migrating, whether in professional services or in material science, will be the ones who will be able to best position themselves for these new business models. So these are the three levels of change that we are likely to see, but we can't get to the third unless we go through the first two.
I mean, some might even say that's revolutionary stuff. But I think one of your most prescient and also novel arguments is where you redefine knowledge as a form of capital, rentable, recombinable, scalable. That once AI can read unstructured sources like meeting notes, audio calls, chat records, and generate shared summaries, that institutional knowledge is disembedded from individual expertise and made reusable in a financial context. If you can imagine, if knowledge of how to determine a loan or a price or a derivative or a stock, or to be able to detect fraud became accessible, a queryable asset across the enterprise, you could see the value in that. And then, of course, this whole it almost eradicates the boundaries between labor and capital, because what once demanded specialized teams in terms of, say, trade settlement exceptions, AML alerts, customer onboarding, KYC, it becomes decomposed into modular workflows that can be executed by AI agents across distributed systems. Institutions traditionally prized for their human expertise may find that their expertise is captured, codified, and leased back to them by technology vendors. And so for financial professionals, this implies a destabilization of the skill premium economy. But as you seem to put it, value shifts from knowing what to do to knowing how to design the systems that decide what to do.
Yeah, I think that's increasingly where the economy is headed, even though we see evidence of it in certain parts of the economy. But I believe that with AI, it's going to, this premium associated with execution is going to go down, and this premium associated with building systems that allocate and manage work is going to be much higher, because traditionally, all of that allocation and governance of work was done very manually. There was a lot of tacit knowledge involved over there. A lot of execution also, which involved tacit knowledge, was very valuable. But with AI, both of those things, the value associated with them shift. So let me make this as a two-part argument. The first thing is, the distinction between where work is performed and where work is managed. And the best way to see that distinction is in the rise of markets like ride hailing and food delivery. So if you think of Uber, there's a clear distinction between two types of worker. It's not simply a capital labor distinction. It's a distinction between those who work and those who design the system that manages the work. So the Uber data scientist designs the system that manages the work, and the Uber driver works within that system and actually works, right? So the Uber data scientist is paid in Uber stock and makes seven figures, and the Uber driver makes less than minimum wage very often because they are thrown into a competitive market where algorithms always push for the lowest clearing price possible, right? Now, this is what I call in the book, I call this a distinction between above the algorithm work and below the algorithm work. So above the algorithm work is where the systems are being designed, and below the algorithm work is when you're stuck to performing within the system. Now, the challenge with this is that the above the algorithm work is actually capitalism, because traditionally what was scarce was capital. Today, what is more scarce is creating allocation technologies that can work at global scale. And so, anybody who builds out allocation technologies that work at global scale, whether it's algorithms of the ad exchanges of Facebook and Google or algorithms of work allocation on Uber, they are very well compensated because they are fundamentally capital allocated. And this is also why, in a way, if you look at the really high salaries that are being given out to AI researchers today, it's really a function of the fact that they are capital allocators, even though their job might look like coding and it may look indistinguishable from somebody who was designing software products in the past. The person designing a software product and coding it, even though they were using the same code, were simply labor. And the AI engineers and designers today are, researchers today, they are capital allocators. So that's one distinction, right, in terms of above the algorithm versus below the algorithm. The second distinction that's important is what actually pushed the drivers below the algorithm was the fact that their most valuable tacit knowledge was taken away from them. So if you remember, the city of London used to have this test of the city of London, which drivers had to pass in order to become a cabbie in London. And it was not easy to pass that test in terms of how to
But
navigate that city.
they would work as pizza delivery or couriers to get the lay of the land and learn the streets.
Exactly. So they would learn it the hard way, but all of that logic was then absorbed into Google Maps and provided to them as a GPS-based navigation system. So the reason I'm making that comparison is because what the maps did was it unbundled or detached the tacit knowledge associated with driving away from the driver and put it into the system. And so all the value that was associated with that tacit knowledge, which is why drivers were paid well, now that value shifted to the system, and eventually that value then shifts to whoever designs the system. So the value associated with that tacit knowledge moved away from the driver to the data scientist. So value gets extracted away from below the algorithm work and moves to above the algorithm workers. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the same thing is increasingly happening with AI today, because AI now takes that logic beyond driving, beyond navigation, to many other forms of knowledge work, because the more we start getting augmented by uh, AI capabilities that perform most of the tacit and high premium work, and we are stuck remaining a human in the loop, just approving or disapproving things, uh, we end up in a place where the premium associated with the work moves away from us and into the system, and so whoever then designs the system gets to capture that premium. So this is a very basic economic logic, but it's not very widely and deeply appreciated because we don't see ourselves as going down the same path as the Uber drivers and the delivery workers, but it's actually the same economic logic that's going to play out across a lot of knowledge work in the years ahead.
What concerns me is what is the place of the human element in this? The maturity, wisdom, judgment, temperament, sheer lived experience. I mean, when you look at the judgmental capacity, I mean, it's where the human in the loop remains vital. As AI commoditizes mental labor, that the scarce resource is no longer information, but discernment, it would seem to me. And so judgment, as you seem to define it, is the ability to act under uncertainty while being held accountable for outcomes, and this clearly has implications for the financial sector because in markets, regulatory actions and credit decisions, uncertainty is endemic. It's perpetual, and so it would seem to me, therefore, that the role of a banker or a regulator or a policymaker then is not to compete with AI speed and pattern recognition, but to frame questions that set the guardrails and interpret ambiguous signals. And see, and really from your book, I mean, two human abilities, curiosity and curation, really seem to come up. That they retain enduring value. That curiosity frames the right questions, and curation determines which answers deserve further consideration. And financial reporting, the parallels seem to be pretty clear. Data analytics can generate thousands of risk correlations, but only good storytelling and narrative, the art of curating which correlations matter and discern a pattern, creates clarity for boards of directors and regulators. The narrative, I think, as you imply, is the last, the last bastion, the last element of human advantage in a machine mediated system. I mean, I'll give you an example that sort of applies to what I'm talking about. We recently won the Agora Award for podcasting excellence from the Compliance Podcast Network in the U.S. Tom Fox, who presented me with the award, said to me, "How do you come up with the ideas? How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep it different?" And I was like, "Well, part of it is objective. We try to follow what the news agenda is, but in terms of topics and guests, that's my own erratic mind at work. My mind likes to wander." So, kind of like when I was a journalist, one day I'm doing securities regulation in South Korea, then I'm onto money laundering, then I'm onto human trafficking. You keep it fresh because even as a journalist, you gain specialty in certain fields by writing about them regularly. But trust me, even that gets bored after a while. So I said, what keeps it fresh, what keeps it interesting, and what keeps people listening is my erratic nature. My mind likes to wander. That's how you can never tell from week to week what topic we're going to present, even though we generally speaking do try to keep abreast of the news agenda in the outside world. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, yeah. So you mentioned quite a few important things over there. So I'll just highlight each of them in turn. So the first thing is that there's a distinction between different types of quote unquote human in the loop, right? The problem is that people just assume the presence of the human as being a positive outcome, but that's not necessarily true. There are very specific human skills that are going to become much more valuable, but just the presence of a human in the loop does not signify any form of value or agency associated with that work. And we can see that with what's happened with the delivery markets, and even with how AI is being trained with human moderation, where those moderators have no agency and no premium associated with their work. So the first thing is, the presence of a human does not guarantee well-paid, dignified work at all. It it means nothing. We really need to think about not just the intrinsic value of what we do, because everything we do has value, but we had to think about the economic value. Is it priced in the market? And we had to think about the contextual value. Is it valued by the system within which we are performing that work? So those things are important, because take the classic example of an Uber driver giving you a good ride. He's only being paid to take you from point A to point B. He's not being paid for how well the air conditioning was running, or whether he was difficult to talk to or easy to talk to. So none of that is getting priced into what he's being paid. And if you feel that your 5-star rating is helping him get compensated, it's not. Uber's rating system only prevents the driver from being thrown out. It does not compensate him better. So my point is that the human in the loop argument has severe limitations unless we clearly define the economic value and the contextual value of the work that's being done. The second point that you mentioned about narrative is very important, and it's a big point in my next book. I mentioned it briefly in this one, and the reason it's a big point is that we are in an economy where the demand for attention is nearly infinite. The supply of attention is very limited, and that's because to a large extent it's happened since the rise of the social web, social networks, the infinite feed, and so on. But alongside that was the explosion of content and explosion of data. And even though data processing technologies, what we now collectively call AI, help manage, make sense of that content and data, and still do the the real ability to capture and harness attention comes through narrative at every level of analysis, if you will. Whether you are running a team or you're Elon Musk or Donald Trump, you are ultimately, you are gaining a premium associated with your skills in general, because you're bundling those skills with the ability to harvest attention using narrative. So narrative is key, because knowledge or the ability to generate answers is no longer scarce. We've been brought up in a world where getting to the answer was the win, right? But in a world of LLMs, getting to answer is not the win. It's the cheapest commodity out there. Creating a narrative that makes sense and solves the audience's problem, speaks to them, that's what creates the win. And so the more we enter a world where attention is scarce, the more we enter the world where it's easy to generate misinformation, the more we enter a world where content is excessive, the more narrative and trust become valuable, because those are the two scarcities that help us harness attention.
In the later chapters of your book, you examine an ongoing technological quandary, whether to create proprietary AI or rely on, off the shelf solutions. And it seems like your test then is what happens if you lose access to your tool, to your equipment. If your business merely suffers an inconvenience, buy. If it's crippled, build. I mean, that this logic reframes the AI adoption strategy not as one of procurement, then, but one of existential design. That AI native firms don't bolt AI onto existing structures; they rebuild their businesses around it. And when I take a step back, I mean, I'd say one of the greatest contributions of your book is its theory of coordination without consensus, quote unquote. That legacy software integration required compliance with standards, schemes, and APIs provided limited rule-based connections. But AI agents are different. They learn across heterogeneity, that they observe how different teams operate. They draw their own inferences regarding intent. They generate shared representations, and that precisely this capacity to align systems without predefined consensus is exactly what more financial and corporate and technical systems lack.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The idea of coordination without consensus is something that plays out at every level, and there are primarily two reasons I believe in the idea of coordination without consensus. The first is that traditionally, if you needed coordination, you had to agree on some common standards and data structures and interfaces in terms of how everybody would expose their assets. First, you don't need structured data anymore. AI can work with unstructured data. So that is one issue that goes away. Second, the nature of interfaces changes. If you look at the classic Google search workflow, where we would search something on Google and then open up 10 different tabs to check out each of the results, and then refine our search on that basis and keep opening up tabs. Today, Chat GPT research does that all as one single collapsed workflow. So the traditional interface boundaries and the traditional workflow boundaries have broken down as well, and will increasingly collapse across the board. So the more that collapse happens, the less you need consensus before coordination, because several steps in the coordination have already been collapsed, and that automatically starts unlocking value for stakeholders. And the third thing, obviously, is that with agentic capabilities, where you don't have to hard code everything, where you have agents who are goal driven and self learning, you can coordinate across non-cooperating actors without necessarily having to hard code each and every if-then statement, if you will, right? So those are technological or technical reasons why this is happening, but the real impact of this plays out at almost every level. So at the consumer level, if you're working with different service providers and they all work in silos, you can potentially now have an assistant that can work across them. And the classic example I take is that of planning a trip. Your hotels may come from one provider, your airline from another, your trip activities from a third, and none of them speak to each other. But with an AI assistant working across them, you can have this interface and this intelligence working on your behalf and coordinating, even if these players do not agree to open up their API in specific ways. But if that assistant builds sufficient demand by just reading all these documents and making sense of the trip and managing it on your behalf, then in response to that demand, the service providers will have to start working with the assistant. So that's an example of a coordination without consensus, helping drive consumer benefits. I talk about the example of coordination without consensus, improving value within the organization, because traditionally the dominant technology that we use for coordination is what we call meetings, which was get into a room, talk to each other, and make sense of what is happening and share information with each other. And AI, especially the current generation of LLMs, are already show us early signs of how that coordination can dramatically improve, because you can have central organizational institutional brains that can be created, where all of the organization's knowledge which are trained on the organization's knowledge, and where the relationships between different forms of knowledge across the organization is encoded, and that can then be served directly into workflows across the organization. So the ability to drive coordination without consensus in the organization is also an pretty powerful mechanism, because the traditional way to do that would have been to ask every single team to create their outputs in a specific format. And today, instead, you can just feed a Zoom meeting audio into a call into an LLM and get highly structured information out of it. So there's a lot of capabilities that can help drive that coordination without consensus in the organization as well. And if you just extend that to coordination between companies in the ecosystem, there are early signs of that happening as well. So that's the key idea that I was trying to propose over here. I do believe that coordination without consensus is not an end state. It just creates the initial gravity to start then delivering that consensus once the value of that coordination starts getting seen.
Something else about your book that resonated with me was the idea of the coordination tax. I think that deserves keen attention, particularly when it comes to legacy financial institutions and corporates with their ever growing legacy IT and data superstructures, one would call different bits of software, different legacy systems piled on top of each other. And as firms scale, as they get bigger, knowledge fragments because you're incorporating different systems from different eras. Teams duplicate effort, data diverges, decisions get delayed. That's just part of the bureaucracy of larger entities and organizations. And AI's ability then to work around, traverse unstructured data means that it can act in a real-time way as a coordination engine, learning an organization's internal logic and how it frames trade-offs and interprets exceptions. I didn't have any further questions for you, but in the time we've got left, is there anything you feel we didn't cover or that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think I'll just reiterate the central statement or the central message of the book, which is that uh, ev- even if you're even if you're struggling to make sense of the investments you've made into AI so far, we're only scratching the surface in terms of what's possible. So, what's really limiting our ability to see the return on these investments in the short term right now is because we are just focusing on speeding things up. We're not really focusing on reimagining our workflows, rethinking our the way we do our work, and even reimagining how we compete. And I think until we get to that level, we're not really going to see the big dramatic returns on the investments that everybody's hoping to see. So I would encourage everyone to think about this at a systems level, at the level of how to reimagine your business around the capabilities of AI, and to uh, really question the assumptions on which our industry works today and whether those assumptions still hold when AI comes in, because that's really where true value will be unlocked.
One last thing, did you want to say anything about the coordination paradox? I mean, I guess, your legacy financial institutions are probably the best example of that, where you have optimization within silos, and, financial institutions treat AI as a cost reduction mechanism, and that can sometimes make a problem worse, because, again, if you have optimization within silos, that leads to dysfunction at the interconnection. So, say one team uses AI to for lending approvals, another to optimize its compliance, another, but there's the absence of a unified coordination logic, and there's inconsistencies around compound risk. So the firms that win are those that rebuild around AI as a connective tissue, reinforcing coordination without consensus. But do you want to say anything about the coordination paradox? 'Cause it's amazing, because
Yeah, sure.
they can use AI for their own needs, but there's no overarching vision for AI for the institution as a whole.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely. I call it the coordination paradox because my whole book talks about how AI is a technology of coordination. But if we look at the last 15, 20 years of digital transformation and any technology adoption, even pre what we call digital, even if we look at monolithic systems of the past, as you mentioned, every generation created fragmentation. But with digital, that increased even further because you had highly specialized, verticalized, micro capabilities, applications. So fragmentation has always increased with technology adoption. The irony or the paradox of AI adoption is that if it's not adopted across teams and across parts of the organization to centrally manage the intelligence in the organization or the knowledge in the organization, but is deployed at different levels by different teams, you'll end up with greater misalignment than with actual alignment and coordination. So that's really the coordination paradox. It's not necessarily unique to AI, but it becomes more of a paradox with AI because, unlike the previous technologies, AI, the power of AI is in coordination. So if you don't think about it strategically at an organization-wide level, and if you let every team, every department run amok with its own priority in terms of which AI to adopt to speed up what, you might end up with a coordination nightmare. So that's the the paradox that I talk about in the book.
Fascinating. I mean, this is a technology that's going to continue to evolve in our lifetimes. So, what great things we yet see. Sangeet, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you. Until next time.